Good afternoon. My name is Gabriel Sanders. I am the new public programs producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm excited to be at the museum and to plan world-class programming with Sydney Yeager, our public programs coordinator, who many of you know. Now in its 24th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs are meant to illuminate the stories of survivors and their descendants, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism through time, and stories of resistance against injustice. Today, we are honored to be joined by Rabbi Dr. Tirzah Firestone. Rabbi Tirzah is an author, Jungian psychotherapist, and a leader in the International Jewish Renewal Movement, and a renowned Jewish scholar and teacher. Widely known for her groundbreaking work on Kabbalah, depth psychology, and the reintegration of the feminine wisdom tradition within Judaism, Rabbi Tirzah lectures and teaches internationally about spiritual and ancient wisdom practices that are honed to assist us at this critical time in world history. Her latest work, Wounds into Wisdom, Healing Intergenerational Jewish Trauma, is the recipient of the 2020 Nautilus Book Award Gold in Psychology and the Jewish Women's Caucus of the Association for Women in Psychology 2020 Book Award. I will post a link to purchase Wounds into Wisdom in the chat and a link to stay in touch with Rabbi Tirzah and receive a free download of the introduction of the book. We also have copies available in our museum bookshop if you would like to come by to purchase it, and also visit our new exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do. If you have questions for Rabbi Tirzah during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Thank you so much for joining us today. I've been grateful to work with Rabbi Tirzah in the past, and I'm happy to have her join us for my first program at the museum. Now I will hand it over to Rabbi Dr. Tirzah Firestone.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to see all of you. Thank you for joining. And thank you to the Museum of Jewish Heritage Public Programs for inviting me to address you today. I'm speaking to you from the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in Boulder, Colorado, where it is very warm this summer. And wherever you are tuning in from, welcome. I will speak for roughly 45 minutes, and then I'd love to hear your comments, your questions, your brief stories. And as Gabriel just told you, I'm a rabbi, this year celebrating my 30th anniversary of my ordination, which is quite shocking to me, and a psychologist. And my work is perhaps like so many of our oeuvres, our life works, is autobiographical. I am the daughter of a mother who escaped Nazi Germany in 1939 as a teenager on the Kindertransport. And it wasn't until I was into my 40s that I discovered that scores of her cousins, in fact all but one of her cousins, all of her uncles and aunts had been murdered in Nazi Europe. My father was an American-born kid, born in Brooklyn. He was deployed in the U.S. Army and dispatched to Germany after they were already married into a prestigious bomb detection squad, which landed him in April of 1945 at the liberation of Buchenwald. There he took photographs. He was a young kid, early 20s. He was completely overwhelmed by what he was seeing. And he took photographs of what he saw, of the unseeable, and stuffed them into his file cabinet and under lock and key. And it wasn't until he died in 1981 that these photos were discovered. You can imagine my shock and horror to discover what he had sealed away, but also in a quite unsurprising way. We understood that these traumas that both my mother and my father had kept secret for all these years had come out, in a sense, sideways, affecting all six of us, all five of my siblings and myself, in a variety of ways that were really difficult to metabolize. So my life as a rabbi and a psychologist has been to understand the mysteries and the riddles of the post-Holocaust generations. How do my parents and grandparents' legacies, both the valuable wisdom legacies as well as their wounds, how did they transfer to us? So big mysteries here. And my research with Jews all over the world has helped me to understand what traumatic wounds look like when they are not metabolized, when they're not digested and worked and processed. There's scientific data now that shows that the universal hallmarks of trauma that's unprocessed is four qualities, four characteristics like emotional numbing, hyperreactivity, a feeling of unsafety or shame in the world, and a propensity to reenact injury. These are the universal hallmarks of trauma, but far more compelling to me and to my research was to ask about who were the people, who were the Jews who did the hard work to surmount their tragedies, to actually metabolize their trauma and their parents' and grandparents' trauma, and allow themselves to go do that hard work and be transformed by the experience, to use, in a sense, to use the trauma to find meaning. And what were the common denominators? What were their secrets? How did they surmount their injuries? So that is really what Wounds into Wisdom is about. I'd love to tell you some stories from my book today, amazing people who I followed, who narrate my book and how they vanquished the negative legacies that they inherited. We have in that book Israelis and Russians and Iranian Jews, and so we have Ashkenazic as well as Mizrahi Jews. But before stories, first, let's go to a few slides. And Gabriel, thank you so much for showing my slides today. Okay, so this is the thesis. That's good. We can go right to this slide with the aspen trees, a tree that's endemic to the Rocky Mountains. This is my thesis, that we are created with the capacity to heal from wreckage, to transform our wounds into wisdom and tragedy into triumph. I know that to be true. I have experienced it in myself, in my family, and in others from around the world, as I said. How is it possible? So let's define a few terms first. Next slide. First of all, here's a word that we see bantered around quite a bit these days, trauma. It's a simple word from the Greek that means wound. It has come to take on many meanings nowadays, but it simply means the residue of any deeply distressing life experience that overwhelms our human capacity for coping. So our nervous systems get overwhelmed. We cannot digest what's before our eyes and what's happening. This could be a physical trauma. It could be an emotional trauma. And my first experience of trauma, I think, was as a 20-year-old girl rushing out into the street, a young man on his motorcycle, not having worn his helmet, had been hit by a car. He was bleeding heavily. I had to steel myself not to pass out, not to get nauseous, and remember to call 911. I had to remove my overwhelming feelings, to compartmentalize them, in a sense, to fragment them, to put them into a room so that I could be functional and get help, which is what I did. Later on, after he had been taken away in an ambulance, I was taken over by feelings and nausea and hyperventilation, and those things came back to me. But what would have happened had I been in a war zone, for instance, and those terrible feelings of processing the trauma were not available to me. I didn't have, let's say I didn't have the moments free. I had to run to the next terrible experience or save another life or etc. I would have had to keep that experience and those overwhelming feelings that I had bottled up perhaps for days or weeks, or in the case of Holocaust experience, for years plus. So Gabor Mate, who many of you may be familiar with, he's a best-selling author, a doctor, traumatologist, who is also a Hungarian Holocaust survivor, said that trauma is a psychic wound that hardens you psychologically, and when we don't process trauma, it interferes with our ability to grow and to develop. I think a lot of what I'm going to say today, my friends, are things that we know, but we'll look at them first through a scientific lens. Next slide. So we come to this whole new field, which is called internationally by the term intergenerational trauma, and this is the unhealed residue of extreme life experiences that is transferred to future generations. Chaimi Shalev, who is an Israeli journalist, put it this way. He's younger than I am. He said, "I am a Jew, and there are scenes of the Holocaust that are indelibly etched in my mind, even though I was not alive at the time." Indelibly etched in my mind, even though I was not alive during the Holocaust. How is that possible? But we know that this is true. We know that the Holocaust has imprinted itself upon us, and we are imprinted with memories of our ancestors, whether we know or don't know them, whether we lived through or did not live through their experiences. So let me tell you a brief story. We'll come back to me, Gabriel, thank you. In part of my research, I came upon a young woman here in the Rocky Mountain area, 30-something, who told me and the psychologist that I work with that her very first memory in this lifetime was a bad dream. It was a recurrent dream that started well before she could speak. And every night that she had this bad dream, she would wake up, start to cry. It would stop in the middle. She would start to cry from the emotional intensity. Her mother would rush into the room, grab her out of her crib, rock her, and shush her and console her, and then put her back in. Well, one day when she was 3 or 4 years old, she couldn't remember exactly, she had verbal skills, and she was able to tell what the story was that she kept having in this dream. And in the dream, she told her mother as a young child, "I'm in an old city, I'm where the trains come, and I see a man jumping down into the train tracks from the platform and running after a train that's leaving. And he's running and he's running and he's running and he can't catch up with the train, and he's crying and he's crying and he's so upset and he's yelling and he's yelling." And then invariably she would wake up because the feelings were so intense. So she's telling her mother this story. And then her mother shakes her head and is starting to weep herself and says, "How could you know this? How could you know this? Nobody's told you this. This is the story of your grandfather. This is the story of his first family. He came home from the black market where he was bargaining for food. He finds his front door open. His family, his children and his wife have all been taken. his Gentile neighbors say, rush to the train station quickly, you might catch them. And he rushes, running, and gets to the train station, jumps from the platform to the train tracks as the train is taking off. And sure enough, just like in the dream, he is extremely, overwhelmingly upset, never catches up with the train, and his family perishes. He doesn't see them again. How could that little girl, who never heard the story, by the way, this is the second family. He is the second family. The mother is his daughter from a second family. How could she possibly have known that memory when no one had told her that story? We don't have data. We don't have research yet about how nightmares imprint, but we do understand that images, traumatic images, are deposited inside of us. Science is now explaining how that we become reservoirs, in a sense, for these traumatic images, visual optics, and the optics get transferred. And so science is teaching us, and science is catching up with what we already know, in a sense. What happens when an entire people experiences these life-changing ordeals? And the field of epigenetics, a branch, in a sense, of neuroscience, is teaching us what we have known in our kishkas, that extreme life experiences, especially when they're not digested, can be transferred to future generations. Let's take a look. Go to the next slide. So the science of epigenetics is the study of inherited stresses. So it's very important to understand this, that it's not genetic changes that happen. Our genetic code does not change, but what the DNA strands carry on top of them. Epi means outside or above, and genetic means the DNA strands, the genetic basis of inheritance. So when we have extreme trauma, that trauma can inhibit or exacerbate gene expression, making us more or less resilient, more able to cope with extreme trauma. Now, these are epigenetic studies are extremely valuable in Israel, for example, and I've read studies in which the psychologists there understand that epigenetic transference of post-traumatic stress disorder is going to show up in the grandchildren of those who have Holocaust backgrounds. Certainly in Mizrahi families as well, but the study that I read in particular was of a scientist, a psychologist in Israel who showed that the Israeli army, the IDF, was particularly attuned to those who came from Holocaust backgrounds, and that their PTSD from being on the front lines would be more severe, and the resilience factor would be less because of epigenetic gene expression inhibition. So let's go to the next slide. The question that we have to ask is, for ourselves, each one of us, what are my epigenetic legacies? What did I inherit from my own family? For those of us who came from Holocaust backgrounds or from trauma backgrounds or anti-Semitic discrimination in our backgrounds from whatever country, what did I inherit? Did my parents exhibit rage or shame, or did they have emotional numbing? What did I pick up inadvertently? As well as, so important that we keep the scales balanced, what were the positive legacies that they transferred to me? And that is so, so important, because the gorgeous values that we hold dear of family loyalty and sticking together, and Jewish loyalty and education and community, all of these values that also get passed down to us. But for our health and well-being, we have to ask, how is it showing up in my nature, without blaming ourselves, without judging ourselves, but just saying this is a fact of life. And I want to strengthen, as Dr. Rachel Yehuda says, I want to strengthen the positive legacies and not feed, so to speak, the negative ones. I want to be very aware of them, but not feed them, and be so aware that I witness them in myself and know how to work with them. So we'll go to the next slide. Very importantly, epigenetic changes are reversible. We are not bound by ancestral limitations. And that's what all the traumatologists the world over, we're going to talk about this for a moment, we can change our epigenetic transmissions. We can change the things that we came into. I personally had came into a family of radical mood disorders and destabilization and sometimes rage or inexplicable mood changes, and never really understanding what had happened. What was it in your family? So the most important thing is, and here's the key, next slide, the key is awareness. And this is not just me saying this is what all the clinicians and all the clinical traumatologists say. Awareness of our transmitted legacies and trauma processes will inhibit transmission of pathology to succeeding generations. So if I am working on myself to become more aware, to say, oh, I grew up in a household with radical mood changes and rageful outbursts. And I see that in myself. I see that tendency in myself. I don't want to inflict that on my children. What can I do about it? The key is awareness. Now, I wanted to say a word about Dr. Yael Danieli. She is, I believe she's a New Yorker, fabulous international traumatologist star, the one who made Intergenerational Legacies. She wrote the encyclopedic handbook of intergenerational worldwide intergenerational legacies, from genocide studies that she did the world over, but heavily leaning into Holocaust studies. And she believes she was born in Israel. And if you ever see her name or can hear her speak, I highly recommend it. We'll go to the next one. Another world famous traumatologist, you may have read his book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's been on the bestseller list for years now, says this: neuroscience research shows that the only way we can change the way we feel is by becoming aware of our inner experience and learning to befriend what is going on inside ourselves. I would say befriend is a very important word there, because we can hate ourselves for what got handed down to us. My paranoia, my unsafety in the world, my sense of shame or guilt at every corner. Or I can say, this didn't begin with me. I come by it honestly and innocently. I can befriend it. I can face it with compassion and face my ancestors with compassion for all that they went through, and work on it in myself, so that my world and my community and my children or students or whomever I come into touch with are greeted with awareness and love and compassion, rather than unconscious automatic reactivity. Next slide. And here we have a wonderful term, which you may be aware of, often just termed PTG. And this is when extreme trauma and psychological struggles change a person in radically positive ways. There's a new branch of neuroscience, which I find wonderful, and I discuss it in my book, Wounds into Wisdom. And this is true for individuals as well as for groups, because when an entire community goes through, as ours has, extremely dramatic events, ongoingly, persistent trauma through the discrimination and through the atrocities that we have lived through, both subtle and blatant. The collective trauma that a collective goes through can literally alter our narrative, and it can alter the psyche, as we say, the very sort of the story that we tell about ourselves. So the question is, how do we use our history and our historical trauma? And we want to ask this question very frankly. I just want to give such a shout out to the Museum of Jewish Heritage for grappling with these questions. You didn't have to. The museum didn't have to, because there's so much richness in just telling the history, telling the stories. We could do that for hundreds of years. But to say, well, wait, let's see, what kind of imprint is our history leaving on us? Is it changing our narrative, our self-definition, how we perceive ourselves, our image, self-image and our image in the world for good? Or is it hyperreactive, hypervigilant? Is it unstable or feeling unsafe in the world? All of those characteristics that we spoke of earlier. Let's go to somebody who I know you know. Next slide. Viktor Frankl. In some ways, he says, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment that it finds meaning. So the question is, what gives us meaning? And one important healing principle is the importance of being witnessed. I'll tell you about this with a story. So let's come back to me, Gabriel. Thank you. One of the stories from a profound, for me, it was a life-changing interaction with a scholar who just died just before my book came out. Dr. Dori Laub, who was a Romanian Holocaust survivor who did profound research. And he introduced me to this man who I call Avi in the book. He is a real person. He was a 4-year-old boy living with his 2 young parents in Krakow, Poland. And the Nazis had corralled, as you may know, all the Jews into one tiny corner of the city of Krakow and put barbed wire fencing around it and called it the Krakow Ghetto. Well, one night, on the eve of a big operation in which they gathered all the children up, pulled them out of the ghetto and took them away, Avi's parents heard rumor that this was going to happen. And they said, no way. And Avi's mother and father decided to act. And they dressed Avi in his warmest clothes, and his mother wrapped him in her shawl. And then she gave him 2 things. She gave him a little slip of paper with an address, which was the address of a Krakow brothel. That's right, a brothel, which actually saved his life on the night of his escape. And here's the thing that I want you to take note of. She gave him a tiny little photograph, her student ID photograph. A tiny little postage, almost like a little bit bigger than a postage stamp, I think. And she locked eyes with her little son. And she said, wherever you are and whenever you need me, whenever you are scared, take out this picture and talk to me, and I will be there. Look at me, look at my eyes, and you'll be okay. And then just after midnight that night, when the guards were looking the other way, she pushed him through that barbed wire. And the story that I tell it's unbelievable. For the next 3 years, until he was 7 years old, He lived on the streets. He lived only for a couple of nights, a couple of days, I think, in the brothel. I forget exactly how long. And then he was pushed onto the street and he lived in people's homes. And whenever he got overwhelmed, he would take out that little photograph and he would talk to his mother. And he would look her in the eyes and say, "Mommy, this war, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go." Once, with some other child, he was taken into some good people's homes, a Catholic family. They clearly must have known that he was Jewish. The mother was very kind, and every night they would pray in front of the crucifix. And every night he would take out his mother's picture and pray to his mother and look at her in the eye and talk to her. And this saved him. He had someone witnessing his pain, even though it was just a two-dimensional photograph. And finally, at the war's end, his parents miraculously survived the labor camp, found him, and were reunited. And the story is phenomenal. I can't go into all the details. It would take too long, but I hope you'll read it. Together, they emigrated ultimately to Palestine, and he joined the Israeli Defense Forces, and he became a nationally acclaimed hero in the Air Force. But on the inside, and this is very important, on the inside, Avi was racked with fear and PTSD. He became this hero. He became like a superhero. But he never worked through his trauma as a young child. And every night he would wake up, this is his telling, by the way, every night he would wake up drenched in sweat with horrible nightmares. And for 35 years, he didn't even tell his wife or children the story. So a few years ago, this wonderful scholar, Dr. Dori Laub, found him and approached him. And Dori was a psychologist who had heard rumors that he survived the Krakow ghetto, which no other child had survived. And he was making video archives of the survivors. And he went to Israel, or I think he was living in Israel at the time. He later taught at Yale. Would Avi please tell the story for the archives? Well, absolutely not. Absolutely not. He hung up the phone. He resisted. He would not do it. And his wife pressed him and said, "Dori, you've lived all these years. You've never told even me. You have to get this off your chest." And finally, Avi relented and told the world what he had been through. This is after going through a lot of soul searching. He finally told the world in video archives what he had gone through from 4 to 7 years old, how he had survived with the help of his mother's photograph. And thousands of people heard him tell his truth. And the night after he videoed that story, he began to have the same nightmare again. And for the first time, he was on the conveyor. It was a conveyor belt that would inevitably end up in the Nazis' hands, rolling into their hands. Only this time he was able to jump off and flee. For the first time, he stopped the nightmare midstream. So let's all take a breath, because hearing these stories can be harrowing and can also bring up our own pain and our own histories. I tell that story because one of the principles that I talk about in Wounds into Wisdom is the importance of community, the importance of telling our story and being heard and being witnessed by each other, as Avi finally was, but also by one significant person. Even though that person he didn't know if she was dead or alive. It was looking into his mother's eyes. So let's go now to 7 principles that I tell in the book that were the common denominators of all the scores of people that I interviewed in my research. What did they say? What were the common threads? Well, one was, you must face your losses. Ultimately, we can't keep secrets. Ultimately, we can't push things under that will only cause unhealth and unwellness. We have to face our losses, face what we've been through, whether this is a personal loss. This is good, by the way, for personal traumas or personal experiences, as well as cultural or collective traumas. We must face our losses, which the Jewish people have been excellent at doing. And then we need to harness the power of our pain. And that comes from that term, harnessing the power. The nuclear power comes from an Israeli friend and colleague who I interviewed and met. He is the executive director, or the Israeli executive director of the Bereaved Family Forum in Israel, a group of Israeli and Palestinians who've lost their children and family members too. And he lost his daughter Smadar in a suicide bombing. And when I interviewed him, he said, my pain was nuclear. It was nuclear. And finally, after a year of being a monster, being constantly in a rage, living in blackness, I asked myself this question. And my question was, am I going to use this nuclear power to produce light or produce darkness, to produce warmth or to produce more pain in the world? Am I going to be radioactive, or am I going to produce energy that the world needs? So we harness the power of our pain and we find our community. Next slide. A community, by the way, is this right here, right now, the community that the museum provides. And I'm so grateful to this museum for that very reason. Number 4 is to resist the call to fear, blame, and dehumanize. We see this in our world. We see this in the United States so much, the polarization that we're feeling, that the other guys, the people on the other side of the aisle, are no longer human. It's their fault. We blame others for what we are going through. And every one of my narrators in the book said some version of this. You have to stop blaming. And you have to stop being the victim. It's not going to get you anywhere. Yes, we were victimized, but to identify as a victim is going to just keep you stuck forever. As Jews, we need to look at, what does it mean to be a chosen people? And as Reuven Moskowitz, one of my brilliant Holocaust survivor narrators, says, but what are we chosen for? And that was the question. That was his mantra. What have I been chosen for? I lived through hell, but I believe that we are, he said, a people that were chosen to bring light into the world. But what does that mean? It doesn't mean to be superior. It means to be responsible. Next slide. So one young Jewish activist, I believe she lives in New York City, said this to me: our grief connects us to others' grief. Our terror connects us to others' terror. The trauma Jews have experienced does not make us separate from other peoples. It connects us to other peoples. And that has been so true for me as I've taken my book and my teachings into places as far-flung as the San Quentin prison, to indigenous peoples in Canada and in the United States, and teaching with African-American traumatologists and leaders, where we find the common bond. And we say there is so much trauma ongoingly that is happening as we speak to so many peoples, minorities, people in active migration, people who are suffering so at so many levels. Can we use our own historical legacies to truly be that light? And finally, our last slide. We are heirs to a tradition that is thousands of years old, and our history so rich with wisdom and the pain of oppression. It urges us to identify with suffering wherever we find it, And the final principle, the seventh principle, which everyone that I interviewed talked about and was living: take action. The people that I interviewed were moral leaders. They were teachers of all kinds, Jews who had surmounted their tragedies. And each one of them said, find a way to take action, whatever that is, with children, in your family, with your own self, in your community. It doesn't matter if it's Jewish or non-Jewish, spread the light. And that is where I will leave us today. We'll take another big breath. And I'd love very much to hear from you. Gabriel, thank you. You did a superb job with the slides. What
Reb Tirzah.
what impacts you? Where are your questions? Are they about the science? Are they about the spirituality? What most intrigues you about this field? And I'd be happy to hear, and all of us would be happy to hear your questions or comments right now. And Gabriel's going to moderate that.
Yeah, so I'll start, and thank you so much, Rabbi Tirzah. Truly incredible and important work for us to be considering, and I know it's a real critical part of the museum's mission to be having these conversations. Let's start with some questions that came in through the chat. Early on, you had mentioned that there were 4 effects of trauma. Can you say what those are?
Yes, I can. I'll review those. And that's a chapter in the book, taking it out of science language, because I'm most assuredly not a scientist. And so everything has had to be broken down very, very far. As Einstein once said famously, make it simple, but make it as simple as possible, but no simpler. So it is simple. And these 4 hallmarks that are cross-cultural from scientists across the world telling us that the first one is called, in science language, dissociation. It's also been called separating ourselves from the trauma, and all of these are life-saving mechanisms to compartmentalize. Remember, I told you that story about the motorcycle accident, to compartmentalize and just say, okay, I'm not going to feel that now. I'm not going to think about that now because I have to stay functional. That's called dissociation. Now, in short spurts, that's extremely healthy, and not only healthy, it's life-saving, because I could help save this young man's life. And during a war, and look what's happening in the Ukraine. People are having to stay very, very functional. And so they have to dissociate to survive from the horror of what they're living through. But ultimately, if we do not make conscious what we have lived through and put together the broken pieces of what we've seen and experienced, we will be damaged people. The second one is called hyperarousal. And hyperarousal is simply another word for getting very reactive, and you're looking at me funny. What do you mean? Or hypervigilant, like always looking around and seeing who's going to hurt me. Now, we know people that have been through car accidents or are boundary violations, who are feeling unsafe constantly, and so they're looking around and making sure that the environment is safe can be a life-saving mechanism. However, if we're doing that 10 years later, then we're in trouble, because our nervous system is on overdrive, and those stress hormones are flooding our system constantly, which means, and that's extremely unhealthy for adrenaline and cortisol and other stress hormones to be in our system. That will shorten our lives. Another one is shame and isolation. That's the third hallmark. Shame and isolation. I did something wrong. There's something wrong with me, that this happened to me. There's something wrong with me, that this happened to my people. There's something wrong with us. And that leads us to a whole conversation of internalized anti-Semitism, internalized shame for being Jewish, internalized feeling bad about myself. There was something wrong. There's another wing of that, which is identifying with the aggressor. Again, we could talk so much more about this, but you'll read about it in the book. And the fourth one is this uncanny one, which the traumatologists truly do not understand, but is the case for everyone, is that hurt people hurt people. As the saying goes, we have a tendency, when we have not become aware of our traumas, to reenact injury on ourselves or on others. And that means that a child who has been abused, God forbid, grows up and unconsciously abuses his children or her children. And this is a known fact. It is a way that we keep reenacting the trauma until it's made conscious. And that's a very short thumbnail sketch, but more stories and more interesting things in the book about that.
Rabbi Tirzah, is there an age where changing epigenetics / trauma, where it ceases to change, or is this something that continues throughout a person's life?
That's such a great question. I have worked with people who are deep into their 80s who are still doing the work. I mean, I have students who are still doing the work in their elder years. There's no yes, we're great grandparents by then, and so we've told them the stories and we've acted out our traumas. But in doing our work, I truly believe it ripples out in a what we call a non-local fashion, so that I'm working on myself locally, but mysteriously, the work that I do on myself ripples out, and it does affect the world and my family and the world that I live in. And it changes me. There's no question that it changes the person who's doing the work. And does it change their world? I've witnessed it. So no, I don't think it's age bound.
Okay, thank you. We do have quite a few more questions, so we will get to as many as possible. And I have posted in the chat links to Rabbi Tirzah's book and ways to stay in touch. Also, the program recording will be available on our website and YouTube channel. There's been a question just about, is there any that you know of groups that are doing this work together, support groups? I know that Yael is on, Yael is on and has shared a link to the work that she is doing. And then
Wonderful.
there's also a
Dr.
question,
Daniele. I'm
a
so glad
question
to know that.
about the audio for the book. Is there going to be an audio available at some point?
I hope so. We're working on that. There is a paperback version with a study guide coming out this fall, and Gabor Mate has written a beautiful foreword. I'm so honored by that. The audiobook probably next year. But I did want to say one thing, and Dr. Daniele would know much more. Remember the very beginning of our talk of the hour, we talked about a 30-something woman who had that recurring nightmare. And the reason why I came into touch with her was because she was in what we call a 3G Holocaust survivor support group with other 30-somethings. And this is several years ago already, but she was one of the healthiest people I've ever met. She was robust and vivacious and was so aware of herself and of her trauma legacy and of the good legacies that she had inherited. And she attributed much of that to the third generation, her 3G survivor support group. And just another factoid that really impressed me was that she said in that group it was nothing special at all, because many of the young people in her group had inherited dreams of their grandparents like her. That's an unrelated comment, but it's something that I forgot to say because I think it's fascinating about trauma transmission. But there are 2G survivor groups all over the world. There are 3G survivor groups, and and there are book groups reading books like Wounds into Wisdom, like all of the Body Keeps a Score, telling the stories, telling our tales. We can tap into those groups, and we can also create our own.
Here's an interesting question, and one that I believe have addressed, but I'd like you to again here. Um, is there an awareness that one needs to know that there was trauma in the family? Is that so critical to actually know that what the trauma was, as opposed to, um, having that awareness? Is that critical to actually know what it was, or just that there was an awareness that trauma existed and
Yeah.
figure out ways to address it?
Yes, and as we've said, awareness is a key. It really is really it will turn it will turn the key and open the door for you. I have many, many people who come my way as students and as clients in psychotherapy who have niggling feelings that something has gone unsaid, that something that there were secrets, because they feel anxious or they feel constant sense of anxiety or shame. And when they start to do their, I want to tell you a story. Let me tell you one story. This is actually from a Mizrahi uh, trauma survivor, a young woman, a 30-something woman who I call in the book Esti. Her parents escaped Tehran in 1982, and it was an unbelievable story how they left, locked up a big mansion in the middle of the night with just a shopping bag of toiletries, and escaped on the back on a donkey cart sitting on opium bundles at midnight across into the Pakistani border. Just an unbelievable story. And Esty came to me because her 7-year-old daughter an extreme case of separation anxiety, and didn't know. They were pulling their hair out. She had been to every school psychologist and family therapist and couldn't get to the bottom of what would help her. So she came to me, Esty came to me, the mom, and I had her do her family tree. And that one part of the family was very pronounced, as she knew every inch of that story. But the other half of the family tree, her father's side, was very opaque. All she knew was that they were from Iran as well, but she didn't know. She thought they were all dead, and big question mark when we made our genogram. And I said, go home and ask, dig a little bit. I'm sure your father can tell you something. Well, she called me that night, and she was all in tears and very, very upset. And I could hear there was just a tumult in the background. And I said, just come in with your mom tomorrow. And sure enough, she did. And what happened was that she had unearthed a horrific and very shameful family secret. And what was the family secret? That they had left during that midnight journey, they had left behind a blind 94-year-old grandmother who knew that they were expecting Esty. That mother was pregnant with Esty at the time. And they just never said goodbye. They didn't want to alert, or she was very vociferous, even though she was very, an ancient old woman, didn't want to alert her caregivers and thought that the whistle might be blown. And so they just never said goodbye. And she died shortly after from separation anxiety and from heartbreak. And here they never memorialized her. They never talked about her. And here was this 7-year-old girl, her granddaughter, who was suffering so deeply from separation that she couldn't let anyone out of her sight. She couldn't go to school. She couldn't have friends. So we see that these things will show up. They'll come out sideways. And we have to be, that's why awareness is so, so important. As soon as and it was a big tumultuous thing. They memorialized the grandmother. They wept many tears. They felt much shame. And they had to feel all these feelings and collect all the trauma fragments of all the feelings that they had pushed away, they had dissociated from. And when they did, within weeks, this little girl was back in school again. Within I think it was 3 weeks, this little girl was like, "Get me out of here! The parents are crazy. I'm going to school." So there is this non-local beshert kind of kismet that happens, this synchronistic healings that happen when we become aware. And I want you to trust that it really, really is healthier to know more than less, and to bring secrets out from below the surface where they've been buried.
Okay, our next question is based on the common bond around trauma. And I know you've talked about this, what would you say is the Jewish connection to the intergenerational trauma experienced by Black people, Indigenous peoples, and people from other communities of colors, especially, for long-standing trauma?
The answer is yes. It's, I take this very much to heart, this question. It's really a question of how do we make meaning of our trauma? And as we've said in so many ways today, trauma can paralyze us. It can stop us in our tracks. Or, as Viktor Frankl says, we can find some way to make meaning. And that often is to reach beyond our own circle, whether that's to our other family members or it's to people from other families and other cultures, to say, I think I get it. I think I can empathize. I think I know what you've been through. And, or maybe I can just sit and you tell me what your story is. Maybe I can serve as a witness as you tell me your story. I know so many of you are engaged in the larger community. I know that. And I'm so proud of our people that we have taken on a disproportionate amount of the therapy and therapists in the world. We have taken on activism and civil rights and social justice issues in the world. And it's, in a way, it's sort of enlightened self-interest. It's lovely for those who are recipients, but it's also, it gives us meaning to share the wealth of our history, both our beautiful values as well as share the empathy that we've harvested from our terrible historical plight.
Thank you. I think we have time just for 2 more questions. I know we have quite a few. So there is that link to connect with Rabbi Tirzah, and I know that you welcome people to do that. So if we don't get to your questions today, do please
do.
reach out, and I know Rabbi Tirzah will be happy to connect with you. You talked about the positive, understanding the positive as well as the negative, and celebrating that as well. The question is, how do you cope with the stress of the trauma effects, such as healthy anxiety, that has been passed down from survivor parents?
Now, that's a good one. Healthy anxiety. Is that what you said, Gabriel? Because there's kind of an exhilaration in understanding and in the awareness that we get. And how do we cope? How do we get to PTG? How do we get to the post-traumatic growth? And for each of us, it's going to be different. For each of us, it's going to be a learning curve, and finding other people, facing our losses, harnessing what we've been through, whether it's personal or collective trauma, finding ways to be witnessed and also witness other people, and to step away from this kind of subtle and not so subtle victimhood. Well, nobody's trauma can compare to mine. That kind of specialness, that is not helpful. So, yeah, I guess the best answer there is that for each of us, it's going to be a different journey. But it really, really helps to find other people who are on the journey, and then to commiserate and to share the wonders of this growth that we're all going through.
Thank you. Since we're at the hour, we'll do just one more. And so this one has to do with, I know there's been a lot of development in psychology, with different experimental types of treatment. This one asks about psychedelics and how that might play a role in ancestral healing. And I wanted to broaden that to a larger, are there other things that can be done to address this in addition to everything you've outlined for us?
Yes. Okay. There is a couple of things I'll speak quickly here. Uh, there, there is there's something that happens when you start this work of unearthing. There, like these synchronicities happen, these beshert things. People call up out of the blue, or you get a letter out of the blue when you start even getting online to ancestry.com or genie.com. I'm sure there are also just Jewish, I know that there are Jewish online genealogical services that you can look up your family. Just that much starts a process, and then things start to unfold. You might get a dream. You might get a letter that comes in off the blue, out of the blue. I have one client who started to do her genealogical work, and she got a call from a antique dealer in the south of, I don't know, it was Tennessee or somewhere far from where she lived, out of state, saying, I think we have your grandfather's or great grandfather's plaque here. Was he a doctor, and was his name such and such? Well, we have it here in our antique store. Crazy things happen. So there's this synchronistic field. I do want to say that many people now are working with psychedelics, and to unearth past traumas and to do healing. And that's not my field, but it is the field of Gabor Mate. And he has worked with many, especially the addiction treatment through psychedelics, and there are many different, plant medicine. Is many different names for this right now. There is even a Jewish psychedelic group that is forming nationally called Shefa, Shefa, that I know about, headed by a rabbi, colleague of mine. So there are many people who are starting to say, I am more than meets the eye, and many of the things that I'm living through and the things that are imprinted in me did not begin with me. And I want to know more, I want to learn more, I want to become more aware. And so I'm going to go deeper and learn more. And and that's the story of Wounds into Wisdom, and so many other people who are writing now and journeying and doing research of their own. And I just want to bless everybody on this journey toward more and more awareness. And thank you, Gabriel, and thank you to the museum for having me today.